So in this video, I want to explore a paper on the seeking system, which is significantly involved in motivation. And it will go beyond that, as we'll see, because it's also about mood and addiction. And in terms of mood, it's about depression mainly. So, first things first, I work as a coach and I use neuropsychology in my coaching. So this video isn't meant to resolve anything, right? It's just an exploration. It's not absolute, it's not exhaustive. I'm going to hit certain parallel cases to some of the mechanisms or some of the cases that are being made, just to give you an idea of the scope. And I think that's important to always kind of, bring into this or bring to people's attention, because the complexity of all of these elements, right? Or like whether it's motivation, whether it's mood, whether it's addiction, you very rarely like derive them to a single thing. There are cases to be made where that is actually the case, but usually it's compounding factors, right? And all of these mechanisms function interdependently anyway. So they kind of like think of it like a web, right? If you pull one string of a spider's web, it kind of reverberates through the whole thing, or at least quite far. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is one of the fundamental aspects and drives of human behavior, and you can relegate a lot to it, or draw back to this drive or these drives, in terms of assessing where something went wrong. And again, like, this isn't really an assessment, it's just an exploration of this paper that I'm going to say the title of soon, and everything that comes with it that I found or find relevant. Um, so that's kind of the main thing going into this, understanding that aspect. Um, and there's always, more, and I've done more videos on some of these topics, or maybe they, run parallel to them. And a lot of my writing will also try to explore this in a combination of a non-linear and a linear fashion, in terms of interconnecting some of these mechanisms, drives, etc. And I have multiple books that do this already, so you can consult those if you want to read deeper, which you can find on Substack, or if you want physical copies, they're on Amazon. Okay, so first things first. I got this paper from Stuart Sims, who was so gracious enough to make me aware of it, because I've been aware of one of the authors, Yak Pangsep, for some time. I hadn't done my due diligence in the sense of reading his papers, right, his works. And Stuart told me that reading the papers was better than just reading his books, because he had a lot more creative control in the writing over his papers than he did for his books. So to really get the spirit of his work, I'm going through some of his papers, and this is one of them. What drove me to make a video about this paper is that I kind of feel that overall it's a neglected aspect, just of neuropsychology in general. I mean, technically in psychology, it's hard to, what is it, like, put up any real attribution or even distribution, maybe distribution is better, of which people know about this, right? So I'm going to assume ignorance. At the same time, there is a sort of like innate intuition or intuitive drive, or maybe an aspect that people can relate to. So even if you don't, necessarily get the science of it, the gist is important. So when I do these explorations of these papers, it's not like every term or concept or part of that paper that you need to understand the finer details of. Like, I think the mechanisms are interesting. Some of these mechanisms will be highlighted, but it's really more about the gist so that you understand the layered nature of why some behaviors happen and why they feel the way they feel, right? And this is what I try to do with clients when I run them through some of these analysis or explorations, so that they understand where this comes from, this drive or this mechanism, or well, where the mechanism comes from is some usually not as relevant, but just how things work, what that implies, what to do about it, etc. So anyway, the paper, and I think they kind of came bundled, so it has two titles. So I'm gonna say the first one, and then we'll get into the second one. It starts with "Why Does Depression Hurt?" Ancestral primary process separation distress, panic, grief, and diminished brain reward seeking processes in the genesis of depressive affect, which leads us to the title of the paper that has been published in Neuroscience and Behavioral Reviews, which says effective neuroscientific and neuropsychoanalytic approaches to two intractable psychiatric problems, why depression feels so bad and what addicts really want, which has been written and synthesized by Margaret R. Zellner, Douglas F. Watt, Mark Solms, and Jaak Panksepp. I'm glad I think I pronounced his name right. So again, like before we get in any deeper, there's two things that I want to definitely highlight. The first one is what they call the single responsibility principle. And I foreshadowed this before what I was saying. You can't always derive something from a single cause, right? Which is the single responsibility principle in effect. So this one, although, right, so there's maybe, extenuating circumstances with this, because this effectively tries to get to the core of it, so as deep as possible as to where these drives reside, come from, and how they function, and how that cascades further down the chain. So I believe, right, Jaak Panksepp, who is basically in I think in a real sense kind of the godfather of affective neuroscience, and I suppose that Mark Solms and him share that first spot. I still have the book here, The Hidden Spring from Mark Solms, which I'm going to read, and I listened to some interviews with him, which I will put up on the screen. It was with machine learning something. I'll come up with the title. And another one that he did with Carl Fristrom, which was also very interesting. Anyway, so in their field of affective neuroscience, you have different systems. So there's the fear system, play, lust, rage, care, seeking, grief. So we're going to explore a part of these. I think the other ones are important as well. I think all of them are important, but because this video is specifically about the seeking system, and then actually it's polar opposite, because what happens when the seeking system is injured in some sense, which is what we're going to explore, then the panic grief system comes online. And we're going to look into this. So pretty like it as a lead-in, because I think this is important. So I think it's pretty important. That's where I was going with my initial sentence. That very often when people think about decision making, they presume and think that decision making is based on a a logical deduction, a logical processes, or a rational process. And hopefully for some people that is indeed the case. Though it's important to understand that there's something called the somatic marker hypothesis, which is a principle or a hypothesis from Antonio Damasio, who showed through a case, the E.V.R. Elliott case, that was an intelligent, articulate man who, after surgical damage to his ventromedial prefrontal cortex, became almost unable to make everyday decisions. And that's pretty important, because that means that when you make everyday decisions, and like all decisions across the spectrum have a root in emotion. And if you kind of look at how the brain is built, despite the fact that it's interconnected, right, your emotions, your limbic cortex is a very significant part of this. I'm not a neuroscientist, so if I get some things wrong, then so be it. But I try to be as precise as possible with what I know, and I'm doing this from memory. So some things might fall to the wayside, or I might get some things wrong, which I'll correct afterwards somewhere, maybe in the description. Anyway, the point being that some of these brain areas, like your ventral medial prefrontal cortex, are important in driving decision making. And we're not going to go too deep into decision making, although it's going to be a part of this. So then you just know where we're starting from. And I think that's a good lead in to the abstract of the paper, which I will read now. And then the rest of the video is kind of building the case around the experiences, and the mechanisms and these drives. So they start off with saying that depression is hypothesized to arise from an evolutionary conserved mechanism to terminate protracted activation of separation distress, the panic grief systems of the brain. A shutdown mechanism which may be in part mediated by downregulation of dopamine-based reward-seeking resources. This shutdown of the brain's core motivational machinery is organized by shifts in multiple peptide systems, particularly increased dynorphin, kappa opioids. Addictions are conceived to be primarily mediated by obsessive behaviors sustained by reward-seeking circuits in the case of psychostimulant abuse, and also powerful consummatory pleasure responses in the case of opioid abuse, which in turn captures seeking circuits. Both forms of addiction, as well as others, eventually deplete reward-seeking resources, leading to a state of dysphoria, which can only temporarily be reversed by drugs of abuse, thereby promoting a negative affect that sustains addictive cycles. Okay, cool. So there's already a lot here that we're going to explore. So one of these things is that depression also has different drivers, and the dysphoria and hedonic feedback loop is that we're going to explore in this video, so like later down the line. If we're kind of pulling this apart, right, it already shows us something very important, that our reward-seeking behavior is effectively being shut down when the panic and grief system jumps on, right? And that a lot of addictive behaviors, their origin, right? And that's why it was in the title, like what addicts really want, stem from this separation distress. And in the attachment literature, it typically originates, right? This is separation distress from the social system that this is a case that Gabor Mate makes in one of his books, The Realm of Hungry Ghosts, that when there's injury to the child's attachment very early on, that can cascade into this, right? So this, again, it's important that, okay, there's always some caveats, and we're going to explore some of them, but then we have the base of the argument and the premise that we're going to explore. The first part of this paper goes into the peptide systems that they were talking about before. So then we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into that segment. I'm going to read parts of the paper, as I've done in other videos, and then add explanation where explanation is warranted, or where I think that it would be crucial in terms of understanding this deeper, right? Like the entire concept. Again, like, you don't need to remember every name, or I'm going to try to explore just what these things mean as the video goes on. And obviously, like, I personally think that all of these terms are important, but even for me, like, it's not like I can keep track of all of them. Now, some of these, of course, I'm far more familiar with than some others, which makes it easier because that's, part of my job. But all just to say that, like, it's less, it's less about the purely scientific and more about what the implications are in your life, right? How this takes place in your life, which is, my main kind of area or job as a coach, is like, okay, what are these implications? What does that mean? And then we'll get there in the video. But then we're just think about that this is a type of balance that I'm trying to look for between the scientific and the gist, if we can put it like that. So the first part, and this is what I've already showcased with Antonio Damasia's somatic marker hypothesis, is that they start off with saying emotions evolve to do something specific in relation to biologically significant and life-changing situations. They are not mere epiphenomena, and second, that the felt aspects of emotion, specific kinds of affect, serve a central purpose, namely to motivate the organism to promote its survival and reproductive success. Which I think, that's pretty self-explanatory. I think a lot of people will just generally go like, yeah, that makes sense. That's an instinctual drive, right, at that level, that most other organisms share with us, or the other way around. So let's get into the systems, right? So we have the seeking and pleasure system, which obviously are connected in certain ways, and then we're going to get into the other systems, the panic and grief system down the line, which is coined by Panksepp, who did a lot of his work very early. Like this, some of these dates are marked here, which is in the 90s, so like 1991, 1998, and then some stuff later down the line in the 2000s. And Solms here is also mentioned very often, so clearly I'm not 100% familiar with the history here, like, but that they've done work together, right? Obviously in this paper and in others. Anyway, so this comes from a paper from Panksepp and some other people back in the day. And he calls it the seeking system, which we're going to explore now, right? So in terms of how motivation, mood, and addiction all feed into these. So the seeking system is regulated by a number of neurochemistries, centrally by dopamine, but also by acetylcholine, GABA, glutamate, serotonin, opioids, orexin, and multiple other peptides. So Panksepp was the first to fully conceptualize that artificial stimulation of this motivational system does not generate pleasurable feelings and blissful satiation in animals, but rather impels the animal to excitedly seek more of the stimulation. In other words, a rewarding brain stimulation along the MFB actually increases the appetitive drive that leads us to rewards rather than the sensory consummatory pleasure that indicates that valuable resources have been obtained by the body. So this is already a pretty important um, principle, right, in terms of the separations of the mechanisms between reward and pleasure. And that's a key aspect to understand, because very often dopamine gets um, equivocated with pleasure. And it's not like it doesn't have any roles into pleasure or whatsoever, rather that it is far more orientated towards the external, towards, as you know, Panksepp obviously conceptualized very elegantly, of the seeking, right? It seeks um, whatever we might find. What was the term for it? Like, not just pleasurable, but the valuable resources, right? And then there is reward valuation, reward reinforcement, reward association, reward anticipation. These are all mediated by dopamine, right? By the mesolimbic dopamine trajectory. And that's why, like, the seeking system is also the expectancy system, right? So it's not just the reward system. That's, could we call it, overly reductionist or overly simple. It's an oversimplification if we just call it a reward system in this way. So they were talking about some other of the peptides and neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine has a lot to do with focus, or as Huberman might say, like the spotlight of attention, which is effectively like, if you're seeking something, right, your salience landscape, your salience means like what stands out to you, it shifts, right? Like it's something stands out, my attention goes towards it, right? Spotlight effect in a certain sense, for depending on a host of factors, and then you kind of hone in on that, right? I'm looking for this thing. I'm locking in on it. GABA is more of the brain on the brake. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It does a lot of different things in terms of the parasympathetic, calm and soothing, and just in general, like the regulation of impulses. Then maybe, like, obviously it has a lot more, right? So I'm just giving you a minor breakdown of GABA. So glutamate is excitatory, which excites neurons in this case. Serotonin has a lot more to do with emotional regulation, so self-regulation. It regulates internal states. So it's also not just pleasure, right? So that's overly reductionist. The opioids, they definitely do deal with pleasure. And I believe orexin, I'm not 100% sure now. Like, I'll have to look into that again. But they're all obviously key features of this system. So moving on, the seeking system motivates animals to engage with the world, to eagerly forage, curiously explore, and optimistically expect. In short, to turn to the outside world for attaining pleasurable experiences. The seeking system, while tonically active, is particularly stimulated internally by medial hypothalamic need detector mechanisms, and externally by enticing opportunities in the world. A lot of these hypothalamic drives, which I kind of already mentioned in the beginning, lust, anger, desire, although like those two things, lust and desire, are very similar. Anger, aggression, they're fundamental drives, right? In the human behavior, but in animal behavior as well. And as it says, right, the seeking system is externally orientated to get from the environment what we need to whatever we need, right? Like, in order to survive and thrive, right? Surviving and thriving are two different things, so it's important to distinguish between these two. So they go on to say that we therefore suggest that the healthy activity of the seeking system, um, which meant like optimal tonic levels of dopamine and appropriate phasic responses of the system to the presence or possibility of rewards, leads to a feeling of engagement, expectancy, and agency, all of which are intrinsically positive. Conversely, the downregulation of this system can be associated with feelings of emptiness, deadness, and a lack of hope and interest. So this is already, like the premise of the paper, kind of very well explained, as we've went through it. The thing that I wanted to kind of highlight is that it's not just about rewards, but it's also about the possibility of resources, right? And this can be effectively anything, right? Like resources and opportunity in the environment are key drivers of motivation and mood. And like conversely, it can be implicated in addiction as well. Obviously, in the sense, right, as we'll later see, that like if I don't have access to these opportunities and those resources and thus potentially these rewards, that sucks. To put it so scientifically, right? Which is effectively where this second part is going to get into. Once we get through the pleasure aspect, then we're going to talk more about this panic grief system. So, as we're developing more of the exploring rather the neuropeptides and everything else, the mechanisms around the pleasure system, that's what we're going to get into next. So the pleasure system or sensory reward system is based on mu opioids. I think it was a thing for micro, but I can't be wrong, as a key neurotransmitter. So it's thought to mediate the hedonic consummatory aspects of numerous rewards, including sex and food. It's pretty straightforward, right? Thus, pleasurable experiences are generated via pleasure and other systems, which utilize the seeking system for their hedonic ends, but consummatory pleasures are not mediated primarily by dopamine, or DA. A specific kind of pleasure arises with social contact and strong attachment bonds, which is also thought to be mediated by opioids as well as other neuropeptides, which is indeed the case. I wrote a book, The Attachment Compass, which goes into this, and oxytocin and vasopressin are key neuropeptides and neurotransmitters that deal with, well, attachment, right? That's primarily, largely their function and their implications. So that's what they're mediated by. So to continue, levels of these peptides signal to the organism whether the organism was socially connected or not, with social pain, separation distress, signaling low levels of these critical opioids. So that's very important, right? We've already kind of highlighted that previously. So when social attachment bonds are broken through separation or loss, these brain mechanisms make the sufferer feel bad in a particular way. This special type of social pain is traditionally termed separation distress and is most readily identified in animal models by distress vocalizations. We have that as well, right? So to continue on this lead into the panic grief system, which is based on this separation distress, either the injury or loss of an attachment or a bond. The biological value of this type of pain is that it motivates the sufferer to seek reunion with the lost object, to draw the attention of the caregiver who may be looking for the lost infant, and to avoid prolonged separation in general. However, if reunion fails to materialize, then a second mechanism kicks in, which shuts down the distress and causes the lost individual to give up, preserving one's energy and staying in one place to maximize the chance of being found and surviving. This giving up has been termed the despair phase of social loss. Huge thing, right? Because this is how you can see that as things develop further, if you remove someone from their opportunities, resources, and rewards, this is very typical of what like this leads to, right? Like this separation distress, and this can be very acute. This can be more subtle in terms of how it is expressed, and then you see people withdrawing into this eventually, perhaps, right? Not everyone's like that, but into this state of giving up, right? This despair phase, kind of, yeah, enduring their separation, which grief is a lot like that, right? People withdraw from the world specifically for this reason because reunion isn't possible, which is, of course, a very painful experience. So to continue, separation distress as a prototypic mammalian affective state may of course also give rise to the important cognitive tertiary process extensions in human that probably do not exist in animals, such as guilt, shame, feelings of desertion, rejection, or abandonment, all of which require complex cognitive processing interacting with this prototype emotional state. Kind of something that I was already saying, right? That a lot of these things, like that's also why they mentioned object, but it can be a person, it can be a place, right? Separation distress is separation distress, being removed from opportunities, resources, and the rewards that come with it. This could be, a specific type of dating pool, just to throw something out there. It can be a geographical opportunity to do something you like. It can be anything, right? And I think that's the important part to kind of highlight, that when people are removed from the things that they enjoy, right? Like whether you're a taller an adult human being, the same systems activate based on the same mechanisms, right? Across the board. There's no separation or difference in there. It's just that what the avenue, objects, person, environments, or whatever it is that you're being separated from that is causing the distress can vary, as the expression of distress can vary. And that, like, as they point out, if that goes on long enough, that is a driver for these depressive states, and giving up, right? That you just kind of go into an energy conservation mode and your seeking system effectively shuts down. And that's part of the premise that we're exploring here. So I think that definitely covers a lot of the mechanisms that were mentioned here, and then we're going to go in deeper onto how these systems behave. But first, I think we're going to explore the behavioral implications a little bit more. As we already saw, effectively, the seeking system is a driver of behavior. I mean, all of them are drivers of behavior, right? Whether they originate, solely, if we can put it like that, in the hypothalamus or somewhere else, it doesn't matter as much as just us understanding that when these drives are functioning properly, that it does certain things. So obviously the seeking system has to do with curiosity and exploration and the goal pursuit. So there's dispositional elements in this, and even neurodevelopmental phases. Like somebody that's high in openness, and I'm one of these people, this I notice that for me, like that doesn't really diminish. I mean, I'm 34, so like it's kind of hard to give you an exhaustive or an absolute or commentary on this. But I noticed that other people that don't have that disposition, they might have a much stronger drive in their 20s, and then that drive starts diminishing because actually the dopamine in your 20s, when you go into your 30s, it flips in terms of dominance, which again kind of intuitively makes sense when you look at the type of you usually hear risky behavior from male adolescents, but it has much more to do with the activation or amplification of these systems. I mean, they're already active. It's just that the neurotransmitter profile will dictate or at least influence and impact the expression thereof, right? So you have people, and like, to kind of continue in terms of dispositions, it's not like this always means that somebody that's curious, that is, how do I put that? Like this is a pretty broad area, right? Like not everyone's curiosity is based in the same things, right? So what it expresses itself or orients towards, what you find salient, is a highly individual, right? What you want to explore, the goals you're pursuing, even like all of these things obviously come together. But just to make a case that, for instance, somebody that's really into exploring countries, right? They really like travel. Like they have a high exploratory drive, but somebody could be much more interested in exploring history, for instance, right? Or other aspects of different fields, whatever. So this is just kind of what I mean with curiosity and exploration being obviously very individual, and that their expressions vary, and that their expression can vary in the same person depending on their neurodevelopmental phase, right? Some people maintain this curiosity, but the lens shifts, right? As you change as a person, so do your goals. So does what you find interesting or salient and what you want to explore. I mean, for instance, right, to use myself as a case subject here, when I was younger in my 20s, a lot of that exploration was, not just mediated externally, but was actually based in a predominantly, movement and psychology. And then as I, got to learn more as I was aging, that shifted into more of neuropsychology. And especially in my 30s, there was a flip towards understanding attachment more at a very deep level, or as deep as I can manage, reading different books, writing a book about it, which I didn't have that type of focus or drive to explore that area when I was younger, right? And you kind of see that this, again, flipping of your orientation around those marks. And that's why why I mentioned these neurodevelopmental phases, because they orient, I would say even predominantly, like where your attention and curiosity and exploration and goal pursuit is going towards. And that's, kind of important to understand, that even if if you're younger, if you're maybe, your late teens or your early 20s, then the way these drives manifest and express themselves are typically going to be different than when you're, aging, than when you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. So that's an aspect to integrate in this, and to, effectively highlight that most people have the same access. Well, let me rephrase that. Most people have these drives, have these systems. Yes. Then there is a lot of bio-individual variance on the intensity of these systems, which is why I started with that. If you don't score very high in openness, and your dopamine sensitivity in the certain ways is not that high, then it's very likely that a lot of things just fall flat, and that you're not that curious, you don't really care about exploring, and maybe like, pursuing goals isn't that important to you. It just depends, right? Like, since everyone has these systems and these mechanisms, it's just a matter of degree, right? All of this falls on a spectrum, which we will highlight. Like, I highlight this all the time, and that's why I think it's important, because it helps you understand people, but primarily it helps you understand yourself. Like, where do I fall in these terms of these drivers of behavior and how they manifest, right? Like, what is salient to me, interesting? Where am I drawn towards, and where do I want to take things? And then, obviously the implications that it has in you finding your way in life, which I believe is rests on this self-understanding. So now that we've highlighted the behaviors or the drivers of these behaviors, we're going to get more into the affective neuroscience model of depression that is a part of this paper. And then that will obviously set the stage for a further discussion on depression down the road in this video. So to continue, they state that one must unfortunately conclude from this that what depression feels like does not matter much in contemporary psychiatric science. Instead, what appears to matter most to contemporary behavioral neuroscience researchers are the physical correlates and causes of depressive behaviors in preclinical animal models. And then, like, that I just found that interesting, because it has a lot to do with that. Some of these researchers in these fields obviously focus on certain aspects and others on other aspects, and that's why they want to, in this paper, highlight what it feels like and why it feels the way that it feels, right? I think we're getting a clearer understanding of how this works. So to continue, additionally, the fundamental participation of a dysregulated HPA axis in depression and the abundant evidence suggesting fundamental linkages between early life stress and depressive vulnerability can lead us in a more productive direction. So the HPA axis stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which, kind of as the word implies, is an axis that connects these three brain areas as a circuit that deals with stress. It's one of the main stress circuits in the brain. So we've already talked about, like, separation distress, especially early in life, right? That obviously, as they point out, it creates depressive vulnerability. But there's other early life stressors in general that also can be, added to this, and that's kind of a case that you're making here. So they go on into a definition here in terms of, like, basic mechanisms. So depression is characterized above all else by a complex of feelings, centrally featuring low self-esteem, a loss of motivation, low energy, a basic hopelessness, and a loss of capacity to experience pleasure in relation to virtually every type of reward. And this is why, like, we're exploring this this antagonistic feature to the seeking system. So continuing that, they're going around some of these about the symptomology, so that they recognize the deep continuity between the symptomology of grief and that of depression, precisely because these systems rely on the same system and mechanisms. So Freud said that in mourning, the external world is impoverished, while in depression, the ego is impoverished. It's quite poetic, right? And we believe that our attention should be refocused on the deep relation between depression and the actual brain mechanisms by which feelings of social loss are encoded, since the despair phase of separation is the normal affective state that most closely resembles clinical depression. Which tells us important things, right? Like, and why we've done this exploration, or are doing this exploration, that when you separate people from certain things, then it's normal to feel the way that you feel. Or if you're separated from resources, opportunities, rewards, right? It makes sense that, depending on how long this takes place, that you enter a state like this, right? A depressive state. And we'll go into that a bit more later, as it, like, what other contributing factors to this could be or maybe. But that's something that we're gonna develop somewhat, again, not exhaustively, because I don't think that serves the purpose, but just to understand that I want to kind of not fall in the trap of the single responsibility principle, but obviously give these guys due and credits to the understanding of how these mechanisms work. So to continue, given the range of experimental effects of the kappa antagonists, we hypothesize that in this condition, the organism is in a quasi-analgesic state, a form of numbness, lowered seeking energy, and impaired hedonic tone in the worst cases, which are the hallmark features of depression. So analgesic, right, as they say, it's a form of numbness, lowered seeking energy. It comes back to this conservation of energy state. Impaired hedonic tone, meaning that you don't really experience a lot of pleasure, depending on how much this tone has been lowered, maybe no pleasure whatsoever. So then they also go into, losses in late life as a driver for depression and obviously grief, because that's which the point is that these kinds of losses are almost universally depressogenic, right? I think most people would agree with that, right? So they continue here. I'm skipping some parts, obviously, just for the sake of the premise and what I think is relevant and important for this video. The constellation of feelings that we call depression means something. They mean that the animal has given up normal pursuits and rewards and has behaviorally shut down. Despair normally follows and shuts down protest, also known as separation distress. So separation distress is mediated in part by the glutamatergic drive and soothed by mu opioid and oxytocin mechanisms. But during the period of active protest, all behavioral indicators, especially the hyperactive agitation, suggest that this emotion has aroused DA-mediated seeking urges, in other words, attempts at reunion. So despair is mediated in part by kappa opioid mechanisms, which shut down seeking through acumen's feedback on the ventral on the VTA. I think it's ventral DA. So I don't remember all of these terms in terms of the acronyms, so excuse me. Anyway, so they already highlight these different stages, and that's why we were talking about glutamate as an excitatory drive. So in the initial phase of separation distress, you have this seeking system still coming online to reestablish reunion, which, again, depending on even the object, person, place, that doesn't technically matter, right? It's just whatever causes you separation distress. The initial part of this protest phase, the active protesting, is an initiator. It's trying to get you back in reunion, and that's, if that can't happen, that's when some of these different phases come online or start becoming more dominant, right? You see a shift. Like again, all of this depends, right? You have things that happen more gradually, and you have things that happen more acutely, which all just depends on the severity or intensity, frequency, and duration of the things that you're experiencing. So to continue, so they go on to say that we have known for a long time that the same opioids that regulate the brain separation attachment responses have powerful antidepressant properties, which is, a very key thing to understand, that's as especially as it relates to why people feel the way that they feel when they're being isolated, right? And that separation distress, because you effectively take away a lot of the opioid neuropeptides, right? So even like, okay, don't get me wrong, dopamine is important. Nobody's going to say that it's not, and serotonin is also important. But some of these other ones, right, in terms of the oxytocin and some of these other opioid neuropeptides, are crucial to our well-being, and that's a part of what they're really trying to drive home here, which is as follows. I think that's exactly what they go into. So fully understanding the contribution of different components of the distress despair shutdown cascade may also help us understand the neural substrates of the various depressive subtypes. For example, dynorphin facilitated shutdown of dopamine driven appetitive systems when an individual gives up in despair may form an independent etiological mechanism in a subset of cases where the loss of motivation features most prominently a sensitized HPA axis with amygdala sensitization might correlate with depression and with anxiety and so on. So all of that to say that in certain cases, the subtypes, you have different expressions of what goes on, which is a kind of a point that I've made before, but I think it's important to keep iterating that, so that we don't get lost in, the formulations here, or the way that they express things. So the amygdala does a lot of this threat detection, but I think, to be more precise, as far as I can remember, it's just about detecting things in general, right? Not just if they're a threat, but then especially as it relates to any type of emotional tagging, let's call it. So that's why they talked about these like correlations, that in certain subtypes, depending on like what your neurology is like, you can have this type of effect. So to move on, I think they start making some of the suggestions in this part already, which is, we suggest in harmony with the psychoanalytic perspective that emphasizes a dynamic relationship between the various components of the mind, that relations between these factors play important roles not only in depression, but also in comorbid conditions such as addiction, panic disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder, which seems to revolve more around panic grief networks than fear anxiety. Similarly, dysregulation of the pleasure and or seeking systems can predispose to some forms of addiction, right? So you see how all of these things effectively come together in this way, and that it sets the stage for how you feel, or even before that, like what your internal experiences are going to be like, which is obviously based on all these different wirings and baselines as to how much dopamine you create, or any other neurotransmitter or neuropeptide that's involved in these systems, because you can just extrapolate, and then you can see how different people have different responses in these ways, and then effectively how all of these things work in tandem, and that these phases are both general and specific in terms of like how long they last, or where one person switches over into one phase rather than another, right? and if whether there's anxiety involved in their separation distress or not, or to which degree. So all of this is highly individual, which also makes it, I mean, outside of the fact that I think this is very interesting, it also just tells you like how much of these elements are really based in attachment, right? And that how that is built from very early on, and that very often that is uh, neglected in certain senses. And I won't say fully across the board. It's definitely gaining more traction now, that understanding and what to do about it. But I think in general it's still kind of it's unfortunately faded into the background, where I feel like it should be much more in the foreground, right? Like it should have much more attention. In this part, we're going to effectively highlight a little bit more of the different aspects that go into depression. And don't get me wrong, right? Again, to be very specific, like I think this part is very important. How this separation distress and this removal from opportunities, resources, and rewards obviously has major implications for your mood that leads into anhedonia and dysphoria, right? So a depressive state. But to just kind of give you an idea of contributing factors, and we're not, again, like this isn't, it's not a video on depression, because it's so multifactorial and difficult to just give you I mean, it's not difficult to give you an oversight. It's difficult to make an attribution. All of this is individual. And I keep saying that because, again, with the whole multifactorial nature of these things, I'm obviously very confident, and I know this from experience, how all of this works. I mean, I've experienced different forms of loss, right? I've had, and I have separation distress that goes into. I had to move from Oslo, which is where I'm still based. I'm still a Norwegian resident, but I was forced to move back to Belgium for a while due to different difficulties with the pandemic and some social things. And then, I'm still haven't been able to move back full time. That's for me personally, when that's the only place that feels like home in the world. That's obviously a very difficult thing to deal with, because other places just don't do it for me. So I'm just making the point that there's so many different avenues, not even just avenues, maybe angles and drivers or origins, causes of depression. And that depending on all of these different factors, like, just genetic sensitivities, for instance, that can contribute to the amplification and expression of depression, or where the scales tip. Now, what else can cause this? So I think in the paper they already highlighted like biotypes, and there was a paper that I read on the biotypes of depression. And I will put that up on the screen, and then you can indeed see that there are different biotypes in terms of how these brain networks are wired, or connected. The other one, I would also consider it a biotype. I think, again, if memory serves me correctly, that's the term that they use in Nutrient Power. I believe that's written by William Walsh, or William J. Walsh. I have the book somewhere around here, but I'll put it up on screen. So in there, they also talk about the different levels of where these breaks happen biologically. So I'm not gonna go through every system now. You can either get a summary or just kind of get the book or read up on his work. Then they talk about like how different mineral ratios, or mineral vitamin ratios, and micronutrient deficiencies drive depression, which is important to understand, that like this is a chicken and an egg situation, right? Sometimes for some people, maybe that they have been significantly depleted in the vitamin or subsets of minerals, or that these ratios are off, or that someone like that can mean some of them too high, some of them too low. That can be if not a cause, a major contributor to depression. Similarly, with vitamin D, there's different bacterial implications in this as well, that if certain bacterial colonies are more dominant than others, or your microbiome makeup is in a certain, I don't know, like state ratio, whatever the proper terminology would be here, that has major implications on moods, because as actually a lot of people don't seemingly notice, but there are certain bacterial colonies that are necessary and involved with creating neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, and some of these other ones that we've been talking about. So that also means that outside of other bacterial signaling up the gut-brain axis, and maybe at other levels of communication, that these are actually very vital, right? And if your gut is inflamed, that has an effect on your mood. So the gut and mood is a completely separate topic in a video, but I'm just trying to show you the linkages. There's other elements like heavy metals in the brain, right? That dictate mood, or heavy metals in the body. And again, like some of these can coexist, right? It can be multiple causes at once, and then they will amplify one thing or the other. Mold is another one. If you're genetically sensitive to mold, and the toxin load of the mold is much higher than your ability to detoxify, that spells problems. So that's why I didn't want to just make it about this separation distress, because it's very plausible, and in my research, it's not more than plausible, highly likely, that if you have separation distress, but all of these other neurobiological elements are, either lacking or dysfunctional, or injured or insulted in some sense, then you have a very, to me, obvious amplification of some of these states, like separation distress. But it goes the other way as well. Like if you have all of these things stacked against you, right, in this like dysfunctional mechanisms, micronutrient deficiencies, toxins, infections, chronic ones, whatever, then that will also impact your dopamine significantly, and thus the activation of your seeking system. And I just wanted to highlight this because I think it's important when we're talking about these things. And this is really just outside of the single responsibility principle, but that if you understand how this amplification works of the most fundamental drives that we have, then there's a lot of things that you can do to make sure that when things do happen, you don't feel worse than you have to. You're going to feel bad anyway, right? In terms of, and not the black pill, but if you lose, a beloved one or anyone that you care about, like feeling bad is natural and normal in this case. It's just that if there's all these other neurometabolic insults happening in the background, then this can spiral significantly. And in my case in making this isn't to make you afraid. It's just to make you aware that all of biology works together and is built on something. So you have this amplification or a decrease of some of these drives when other things are going awry, neurologically or anywhere else biologically. So I would even add that as this paper moves into the addiction part, that addictive tendencies can also be amplified by some of these things, because sometimes maybe directly, but I would wager indirectly, because they steal crucial resources or impact systems like GABA that you need to resist impulses or desires. So when you put these things together, it's very important, not just to understand, but to make sure that your neurobiological garden is tended to properly, so that everything, you can do this through different functional medicine tests if you like, but that everything is working, if not optimal, then at least good, right? Anywhere between good, great to optimal, so that you can properly function in times of extreme duress. Or if it's not about duress or addiction, that your seeking system can do, like, let's say, run at its highest potential, because it's already been shown that, and this should be obvious, right, that when the body is highly inflamed, it covers dopamine receptors. That makes you a less, what is the word for it? It makes you less willing, it makes you less motivated to move physically. But this isn't just about the physical drive, it's just that it lowers drive, because these dopamine receptors being covered or damaged by inflammation obviously carries forward in the psychological realm rather than just the physical realm, and it makes you less, driven, literally, in this case, psychologically, for things like curiosity, goal pursuit, and exploration. So a big part of my job when I do this exploration with clients is to kind of figure out, like, is this really like actual wiring personality traits, or is there just extensive neurobiological or biological damage, wherever these occur, that we need to resolve, and only to find out that, hey, it's not really your personality, it's just that you're dealing with certain things, mechanisms that have been insulted and injured and damaged, that all don't allow for a proper expression of these drives, right? Just as I was saying about, like, your drive in terms of exploration, and your drive to move, your drive to be motivated, all of these things that come in that seeking system. So I hope that makes sense. So when we're moving on now into the addiction part of things, and I'm keeping it in this section because I think, typically, I mean, I'm not sure if I can say typically, but you see in a lot of cases that people that get this drop in dopamine, right, towards anhedonia and dysphoria, and that's why they put it in the paper, right, that they're with this homeostatic injury or homeostatic deviation, so to call it, that they need something else to get them out of it when they can't do it themselves. Other people in their environment can't do it, or as we've seen, when you are removed from things in your environment that would do this naturally, which is the key here, right? Like, the assumption here is that, okay, I'm removed from the things in my environment, the opportunities, not just for resources, but the opportunities to feel good through whatever avenue that comes, and through my behaviors and interactions. And now I need to rely on something external, right? So if I start feeling bad, or anyone in this case, in terms of this scenario, then there is a higher likelihood or a gravitation towards mending their homeostatic imbalance by taking a drug. So this is what we're getting into next. So they state here that the difficulty is that the drugs of abuse allow appetitive reward and consummatory reward systems to be stimulated artificially, generating positive affect without the natural, effortful, and competent behavior patterns that typically mediate the acquisition of rewards. Right? It's important to state, I think, because that obviously, it tells the brain that you can get things without any effort or without any competence, right? And this is, again, like a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, because let's say that you did have these behaviors and you did have the competence, but that you're through whatever reason, right? You're locked out of your environment in order to gain these. Then obviously you get a negative feedback spiral or a negative feedback loop or a downward spiral in this way, which is what I think they're getting into somewhat. So the motivation to perform the effortful work to achieve biologically useful goals in an indifferent and even hostile world is thereby substituted by mere self-administration of pleasure-producing or unpleasure-reducing producing rather. Or no, they do say unpleasure-reducing substances. And this is kind of what we've been saying, right? Or what I just said, that when that is the case, then when the case is that you're in a hostile environment, indifferent, or literally just locked away. I don't mean in prison, but like, let's take the epidemic, the lockdown the pandemic, the lockdown as an example. Then that can also again like drive you into dysphoria and anhedonia, relying on something else and changing your feedback loop and well, all of these neurological feedback loops that deal with effort and reward and behavior, right? So to continue, I'm skipping a part here that goes into about the manifestations of drug addictions. It is sad, but an incontrovertible fact that our biological needs cannot be met narcissistically by mere feeling of reward versus actual achievement of reward. Biological needs represent a true lack in the organism that can only be rectified by a specific object in the outside world. So I feel like that's pretty clear, right? Like if you're pining for a romantic attachment and you can't get that, fantasizing about it is not the same as having one, right? Or getting married or having kids. Or this is just one social aspect. It can be many different things, just especially for men who are more goal-oriented and driven in this way. Like it can be something about a certain success, right, in whatever field it is that they're inclined towards. So to move on, it is difficult to imagine why animals would ever bother with effort and a risk and not just go straight for the reward. We argue that this is because of the mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine systems, or DA system, is not a simple sensory pleasure reward system at all. So I believe that was because they were testing animals in a way that showed that if you just gave them that like dopamine or like pleasurable experiences, that's not the only thing that matters. They make a distinction here that we're going to highlight. So distinction between the mammalian brain mechanisms for wanting and liking, with wanting being just one step removed from seeking. That's interesting. So in contrast, it is ever increasingly clear that the feeling of satisfaction for many of the specific rewards of the natural world are mediated by endogenous opioids and range from social rewards to more discrete items such as tasty food, which one has to ingest. The distinction between the brain's appetitive and consummatory reward mechanisms helps to make sense of the fact that addicts do not generally find their psychostimulant substance-induced dopamine surges to be pleasurable. At times, they don't even like the objects of their addictive wants, right? And that's why they say that like, it's very different wanting and liking, and that these mechanisms effectively get hijacked. The concept of liking is linked more to the attractive power of sensory perceptual process, to incentive salience. In this latter model, dopamine activity is said to predict which objects are likely to produce pleasurable experiences, incentive, and thereby to motivate the animal to selectively attend to such objects, salience. Which is, like you see that in addicts or in addictive behaviors, in as far as they're pathological or not, right? That they call this reciprocal narrowing, that the scope of what they want and desire starts narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing until it's only about this one single thing. And then they go on to state, and this is like they're making a part of their case here, that in the natural courses of events, animals have to, 1, be driven to seek the object of its biological needs in the outside world, surely an invigorating appetitive action activity, before they can, 2, experience the pleasurable rewards that such objects generate, which in turn enables the animals to, 3, learn from such experiences, in other words, associate specific objects with the pleasurable relief of each biological need. Only then can animals have any basis for predicting appropriate pleasures from the sight or smell of specific objects, which is called attribute incentive salience. In short, Incentive salience relies on past learning, while seeking is an intrinsic emotional affective system that allows learning to occur. Right. So when very often when they talk about like dopamine in certain ways, especially when it comes to addiction, they kind of like make dopamine out to be a problem when it's really just a reinforcement, right? Like as you're learning, like this is a system that learns that I can get this thing without doing other things. And, in that type of environment, or when it's pushed to that far, then that's what it will do. So here's another like interesting aspect when it comes to addiction, that they found that D2 receptors are consistently decreased in addicts even long after the resolution of acute withdrawal effects. So recent research has also shown that the relatively decreased D2 receptors precede the development of an addiction that may in fact be an important biological marker of addictive vulnerability, which is something that we've said, or at least hinted towards before in what I was saying. So when you have these dopamine receptors, right, D2 receptors, and they're decreased, that means that your response to naturally occurring or created dopamine inside the brain is also decreased. Like it almost doesn't matter how much dopamine then you are creating if the amount of binding is very low. And that's obviously a problem, right? In this way. So then you have a difference here, but a conjoining process of where if you artificially flood the brain, it's with something like cocaine, for instance, then it's the dopamine systems in terms of receptors are going to try to reduce the receptor count so that you don't fry your brain. But that creates a negative feedback loop, because your ability to produce dopamine internally gets reduced eventually, but then your receptors also get reduced, right? So you see that's that's what I meant with some of these downward spirals before. And then we can see from what they say that if you already are predisposed to this, let's say genetically, or something has happened early on in life, that those D2 receptors are decreased, then it's your, what is it? Not your ability, but rather your need for homeostasis is going to be very different for somebody that doesn't have that, right? And that there's a large dividing line between people that get enough out of their dopamine internally, or right, have access to their environment in a way that stimulates dopamine and other neurotransmitters, and then especially socially with other people that don't, right? That's a major dividing line, which they go into here. So individuals with blunted seeking capacities come to learn, especially if not otherwise helped by parents, educators, and the like, that substances which produce massive surges of D2-mediated activity enable them to gain access to pleasurable experiences and objects in the outside world that would otherwise be relatively inaccessible to them. Pretty important to understand, right? So they go on to say that rather the possibility or expectation or even hope of gaining social, sexual, and other biological useful rewards, possibilities that the substance artificially evokes, which is why we come, back to these like the original drives in this way, right? And that the environment is supposed to facilitate that, and these things can happen constructively, but when they don't, then there's a shift in behavior. Additionally, as they move on in this paper, the pleasure, lust, or liking aspect of the reward process is primarily mediated by opioids acting on mu and delta receptors in the basal forebrain region in particular. So the hedonic, analgesic, and social soothing properties of opioids are difficult to separate entirely, especially when considered from the lived viewpoint of what a substance abuser is trying to achieve. A diagnostic differentiation of this kind would certainly be clinically important, as indeed is the more basic distinction we have already drawn between those who are seeking dopamine stimulation and those who are seeking opioid-mediated euphoria or relief, so uppers versus downers. And that's effectively, what they try to conceptualize here, and why I always come back to these bio-individual um, elements, right? Because that is important to understand. So then they kind of like go into what I was saying earlier on about attachments. Um, that neurochemically speaking, we cling to our mothers and lovers in order to keep our mu opioid receptor activity contentedly high and to prevent them from dropping distressingly low. So now it is of the utmost importance to note that the attachment process initiated by these instinctual systems have most of the hallmarks of addiction. So to them, and I agree with this assessment, and this is also what Gabor Mate saw, so attachment is a primary form of addiction, or perhaps accurately, addiction is a deranged form of attachment. Which is, like they go on to state here, as importantly, we presume that pleasurable sensations notwithstanding, what distinguishes, then they go into a part of that they were talking about in this paper that I skipped, as it comes to pleasure and the artificial means. So then they go into masturbation. What distinguishes masturbation from actual copulation is not an absence of object seeking, but a frustration of object seeking, which is also like, that's interesting, right? Because people would attribute that to very different reasons, and it can be for different reasons, but this is what they go on to state, right? That what the addict really wants is not a drug, but rather an actual reason to feel safe, warm, and cared about. And that has a lot to do with what we were saying about these drives and the origin of these drives. And I don't mean this neurologically, I mean this like socially, in terms of like primary caretaker and infant relationships, or rather attachment that is formed at that base, at that base for human behavior and socialization. And if something happens there, then this can amount into these issues. So then they go on to state that all addictions are driven by, one, a primary appetitive process called the seeking system, plus two, with some agents like opioids, a primary consummatory hedonic process we call the primary process pleasure, which rewards the seeking activity and thereby allows or learning to occur, plus three, a primary social process called attachment, which is mediated by the panic grief system. And once an attachment is established, reunion with the object of attachment is the specific pleasure that the addict seeks. And then we skip a little part here. We, by contrast, think that the addict really wants to, one, arouse appetite of seeking a euphoria, especially in the case of psychostimulants, withdrawal of which also produces an opponent process that is dysphoric in a way resembling lost attachment, which highlights, two, that opioid addicts specifically seek to restore lost attachments, mu opioid mediated feelings of dysphoria that are partly mediated by the psychological pain of social loss, panic grief, as well as eventual underactivity of the seeking urge, the despair of depression. And that kind of ties different aspects of this paper together, especially in terms of like where these things come from and how they occur, and why that's important to understand, and effectively why these levels that we've been talking about in terms of the environment and the opportunities, resources, and rewards that it allows for, affords, right, are so important, especially socially. And I think that's the key of the paper in terms of all of the attachment aspects or elements that are typically maybe, again, like, I don't think they're technically overlooked. Like, I'm not quite sure how to explain it, or rather than like when I've talked to people about this, when I relate it to their core attachment, injuries and experiences, that's when it starts making sense to them. But you can see from, if you've gotten this far in the video, how layered this is. So it's just saying like, oh, something must have happened in your childhood, like that, they can make a leap to that and go like, yeah, maybe that's the case. But if you start looking at these systems and how important attachment is in all of this, that understanding is kind of like you lead them by the hand to these insights that come from, oh yeah, when this and that had happened, or they talk to their parents or retrospect, and then a lot more clarity comes from this. At least from my experience coaching people that have had or have addictive issues. And don't get me wrong, to be precise, like addiction isn't my area of coaching. It's just that, as you can see, and the point that I very often make, everything is in function of degree. So it's not just like, it's not about like yes or no, right? The binary, do you have any addictive tendencies? It's to which degree and when do they show up? And then that gives us a very good, I would argue, model or framework, or helping to help people navigate this, when especially when it's about this restoring, of the separation or reunion, right? And repairing the separation and moving through the separation distress. To kind of end on a more positive note, so to call it, it's also just what I do with clients, effectively bringing them back, you know, you could say to homeostasis, but I just mean to help them navigate their reunion, right? Or restoring. So obviously some of these things, as we were talking about, they're social, environmental, and we've already covered those things. I think another thing that maybe I should have mentioned, but I don't think it was in the paper. At least I don't remember it. And now we've gone through a significant part of it. It's reconnecting with your purpose, and again, seeing the scope of everything that we've just gone through in terms of the amount of different aspects that go into how can we put this, like removing you from this sensory experience, right, or somatic experience or emotional experience of your goals or your purpose, and the way that they relate, obviously, but especially these systems. There's always a case that I make in the initial term. It's like, okay, we need to make sure that all of the neurobiology and biology is addressed, from organ systems to other systems to your brain, and this happens through various modalities, sometimes through various interventions or therapies. And again, because like this is it's all very individual. There's certain things that work across the board, but everything works, again, the bell curve thing, to a certain degree. So I can't make any general recommendations. I do kind of at least explore that deeper in the books. So if you want to read those, then the Attachment Compass, the Path to Your Aspirational Self, and the up and coming book, the Intuitive Self, that has everything to do with emotion, intuition, in interoception, will go into modalities of restoring or restoration, or different interventions or therapies that you can use, because all of these like layers of interconnectedness, right? So that complexity is more difficult to navigate just by a video, although like I'm sure it's possible. I just think it's easier in a written format to kind of run you through it. Anyway, the point is that very often we're looking at levels of having been disconnected, or levels of injury to the attachments, in that can be socially, that can be in environmentally, and these are the things then that are worth exploring. Like, where did the injury happen? Perhaps when? What are the things that I'm going to have to do in order to reestablish that? And this again is like a kind of a catch-22, that if there's other neurobiological issues at play, getting that seeking system and your drives online is much harder. it's pushing a boulder uphill. And sometimes, like, you don't have the resources. It's another part of this catch-22 to resolve that, and then there's not much left to do than whatever you can do in order to crawl your way back in a way, right? And sometimes that these behaviors, as they are dictated by different things, sometimes a single intervention can be helpful, whether that's nutrition or sleep or a supplement. These can be aspects that are helpful, but the main premise that I really want to drive home is really about how much of that disconnecting or disconnection of the environment is driving, as they say, right, a lot of these anhedonic dysphoric states based on the panic grief systems coming online. And thus, that, as they pointed out, a lot of it is social, a lot of it is attachment based. And that's starting there, right, with reestablishing or repairing some of these relationships, and then moving into the world in the ways that allow you to interact with your opportunities or chase your opportunities even is key in order to have your seeking system running again or at a higher level. So those would be the avenues to really explore, right? And a lot of it is just typically based on the same thing. It's finding a mate, it's being valued, it's being respected, it's having a type of success or achievement that are relevant to you, and getting recognized for your contributions to your environment or your field or maybe society or whatever it is that you're really into or orientate towards. So I hope that was helpful or at least insightful, and that you can kind of troubleshoot this. Like, it's not based to diagnose people in terms of what you have. It's just here to help you understand what you're going through, and potentially help deal with some of the emotional aspects that go into this, like guilt and shame, and especially in terms of how you perceive yourself, right? How you effectively self-identify or co-identify, and then it helps move you away from, like, okay, this is something that is wrong with me, rather into something that is wrong either neurobiologically or having been disconnected, or a forced disconnection like me, with also from the environment that affords things or makes you feel good and allows you to tap into these opioids and dopamine systems naturally without you having to gravitate towards other behaviors or substances. So if you like this video, subscribe and like. If you want to read the books, then you can find them on Substack and Amazon. If you have questions, then put them in the comments section, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys either think or maybe experiences you want to share of where you have restored your seeking system by reestablishing your attachments and reconnecting to your purpose, or even just that you moved to another place that had more of what you wanted, right? I'm always curious to hear about other people's experiences, so by all means, please share them with me.